India, a lot of the discussion about is India in a middle income trap, think that India is a really good foundation for a big push on things like technology, or things like energy, or socioeconomic mobility.
Professor Dr. Indermit Gill. Indermit is Chief Economist of the World Bank Group and Senior Vice President for Development Economics. Between 2016 and 21, he was a Professor of Public Policy at Duke University and non-resident Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Professor Gill also led the World Bank's influential 2009 World Development Report on Economic Geography, and his work, amongst various other things, includes introducing the concept of the middle income trap.
When countries become high income, according to the World Bank's definition, they reach a per capita income level of around $15,000. Countries that have grown from middle income to high income during the last 3 decades, there are about 30 of them. Their population doesn't add up to the population of Pakistan. Standard problem in middle income countries: we have less talent and we allocate it less efficiently. Ultimately, it really is about becoming much, much more efficient in how you use capital, how you use talent, how you use energy. I think India is on the right track. If there's any quibble that we should be discussing, is the speed. We have an economic policy making process that is actually good for an agrarian India, but not an urban India. And I think one needs to see whether or not we actually give enough political and economic power to essentially cities. When I go to Delhi and talk to people in the central government, I sense an urgency. Then when I go to some of the states, I don't sense the same urgency about economic development. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Likewise, I'm excited for our conversation today. I've been waiting to have you on the podcast. I think there's a lot of your work that you had put out even during your time at Brookings that was very helpful in my own thinking as I thought about the tech strategies that countries need to adopt. And I know you were looking at the intersection of technology and growth and economic development, even during your work at Brookings. And of course, with your work at the World Bank now, with the most recent World Development Report 2024 that you've put out, a lot of the recommendations, as I was reading them, seem to be at the intersection of technological adoption, technological invention, investment in technology for countries, especially the middle income countries. So I look forward to unpacking a lot of that. But before we get into that, I want to talk about your journey. You obviously have had a very interesting journey for the last few decades. So walk us through some of those highlights that, when you look back, I know it might be a bit too early in the morning for you
No,
to do
no, it
that,
isn't.
but reflect back for us and tell us some of the highlights of your personal professional journey. And then as much as you can, also tell us as an economist how you've seen the world economy and economics as a profession evolve, alongside your own journey.
So Anirudh, I grew up in India. I grew up in a services family. Actually, my father was in the army. His younger brother was in the Air Force, and their younger brother, the third one, was actually in the Navy. So we had all three services covered. Yeah, and my grandfather was in the police. So in case there was one thing, so everything. Yes, but then so I grew up in India, and I think the first place that I really learned economics was at the Delhi School of Economics. I had very, very good teachers there. I had teachers like K.L. Krishna. There was a professor who I'm sure that those Indians who actually have read economic history would know of, Dharma Kumar. She was excellent. And then there was Pranoy Roy, who was a real mentor for me, and so was Surjit Bhalla. And then when I came to the US, Rakesh Mohan was actually a big influence on me. So I had a lot of help back then. I learned microeconomics from Kaushik Basu. Actually, he was also at the Delhi School of Economics at the time. I mean, so I thought that I was at the Delhi School of Economics at a fantastic time.
Yeah.
So from there, I went to the University of Chicago. And I think that was an influence that was probably because of Professor K.L. Krishna, who actually was from the University of Chicago. So all of the people there at the Delhi School of Economics at the time were people who had studied abroad and worked in India and so on. They brought a lot of these fantastic ideas, fantastic ideas. So it was truly a global institution already. And I'm talking about 1981 to 1983.
Yeah.
And then from there, I went to the University of Chicago. And then after teaching for a bit, I joined the World Bank. I remember when I was leaving. So at that time, India was very different at that time, Anirudh. I mean, people who left India, it was often a one-way move. Unlike
Yes.
you, for example, you came here, but then you went back. It's a very natural thing for you to do now. So I think the world of development has changed massively. Anyway, I still remember at the time when my father asked me if I couldn't do a PhD in India instead of going to the University of Chicago. And I said, don't worry, I'll be back after 4 years. And he said something like, well, if you're back after 4 years, you're either a failure or a saint. And I don't want you to be either, you know? Yeah. So I don't think a father would say that today. Yeah. So India was very good to me, and the United States was very good to me. I love these two countries.
And how have you seen the profession evolve, especially given that you studied at, let's say U Chicago, which is known for its own school of economic thought, right, and has produced its own, I would say, very well-known lineage of economic philosophers and economists, and of course, the SC Delhi School of Economics having a, I would say, similarly illustrious lineage of alums who've shaped economic policy not just in India, but I would say at institutions like the World Bank, but elsewhere as well. How have you seen the profession evolve? How have you seen economic thought evolve? Right? Any key trends you've seen?
So one of them, I think, is I think that what has happened is that the role of government, the thinking about the role of government has shifted. It used to be that government was involved in making steel and making shoes and everything. And I think that thinking has changed a lot. Now it's much more about making sure that the rules and regulations are well set and so on, and let the private sector do it. So I think this thing about having the government take the lead on economic activity, that part has changed a lot. The second part that has changed is, I think, in general, there was a growing sense that you needed macro stability. Macro stability meant low inflation, and it meant keeping budget deficits in control. I think the thinking on that one, at least until a few years back, it had shifted completely from trying to sort of, essentially risking inflation and so on, to making sure that inflation, which is bad for the economy and terrible for the poor, and really bad for long term decision making and so on. So I think that consensus had taken root, or has taken root, I would sort of say. And the third part, I think, that had happened had to do with international trade. So, in the sense, there was a growing sense that, or there was a general sense that international trade was very good for developing countries, especially the smaller developing countries, but also big ones like India and China. And I think all of those things, there was a big shift between 1983 and about 2015, I would sort of say. There was this new consensus. Since that time, over the last decade or so, there's been a lot more confusion. So now actually the world is actually a bit more confused than it was back 10 years back. And I think that if it weren't, I would actually say that the prospects for countries like India and all would be better, not worse. So I think that some kind of a consensus it won't look exactly the same as what it was 10 years back, but it ought to have some of the same elements, which is that the private sector should take the lead, which is that you should have macro stability, not high levels of public debt, high levels of inflation, big budget deficits, and so on. You shouldn't have that. And a sense that, look, international trade is very important because developing countries, especially, they become suppliers of goods before they become demanders.
Yeah,
And I think it's very important for them to be able to do this.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so I confess I'm somewhat actually not happy with the way things are right now as compared to 10 years back. 10 years back, when I left the World Bank, I thought that the world was in a very, very good place in the sense of that there were many countries that had gone from low income, which is less than about $1,000 per capita, to middle income. And the idea was that these countries would then go on to high income, right? And I thought that things were on track for that? I'm not so sure today.
Yeah, yeah. No, which is a great segue. I want to come back to some of the threads you've pointed out and the analogies you've drawn with the 80s and now over the course of our conversation. But I think it's a good segue when we're talking about the fact that your own thinking about the prospects of these countries to climb up the development ladder, so to say, is not as optimistic. It's a good segue to talk about, I think, the most recent piece of research that you and your team have put out, the World Development Report 2024. Of course, I think back in 2009 itself, before you'd left the bank, as you were referring to, you'd been part of the idea of the middle income trap. So let's lay that concept out. And I know that the WDR 24 has some very, I would say, relevant and newer pathways that you've recommended for countries to adopt, given the churn that you were referring to. But let's start with the middle income trap, and then we'll maybe get into some of the recommendations of the report.
So the middle income trap, Anirudh, was an idea that we stumbled upon actually. So this was when Homi Kharas and Homi was my boss at the time. He was chief economist for East Asia, a really great thinker actually. So he and I were working on a report along with our team on East Asia. This was East Asia about 10 years after the crisis that East Asia had had in the 1990s. And East Asia had been transformed because back then Japan, I think during the crisis or before the crisis, Japan was the glue that held the region together. By the time we wrote this book, it was China, and but the main concern that a lot of countries like Indonesia and China and Vietnam and others had was that they felt that increasingly when they looked at their structures, they look more like the structures of Latin American countries like Brazil and Argentina and Mexico, rather than those of Japan and Korea and Taiwan and so on. And
In
so
what
they were
way?
worried. Sorry?
In what way were their structures more similar to the Latin American
So,
counterparts?
for example, they were very worried about inequality. They felt there was a rising amount of inequality in their countries, which Japan and Korea and all did not have. They were also worried about whether or not they could replicate the same strategies, especially China, right? Because you actually had that these countries all exported their way out. They exported their way out of underdevelopment. And but they also had policies that we would actually now call industrial policy. But they were lucky in the sense that they had a competitive world environment in which they could see whether or not their industrial policy was working or not. Because the economic activities that they were encouraging at home could be tested in terms of whether or not these were the right things in a competitive economic environment. And I think that all of these countries started to worry a little bit about those kind of things. I mean, I can tell you more about that, but essentially what happened was that we then tried to sort of take a look to sort of see if that was indeed true. And the thing that we sort of saw was that actually Latin American countries did actually do very well in terms of economic growth and structural change and so on until about the early 70s. And then after that, you found that their per capita incomes had not really grown for the next 3 decades. In fact, in some cases, they had grown a bit and then gone back, and they had a debt crisis and all of these things. So that was what they were worried about. And so what we started to sort of look was to sort of see whether or not is it that they actually stopped doing some of the things that the Koreas and the Japans and all had done. And the answer, broadly speaking, is yes. Okay, I think many of these countries tended to have import substitution strategies, broadly speaking. And those import substitution strategies were usually accompanied by a huge push on subsidies for innovation at home, trying to develop technologies that you actually basically wanted homegrown technologies and so on. The classic case of this was Brazil, of course, and once you start to sort of get into that, those are the antecedents essentially of the 3I framework that we have in the 2024 World Development Report. But to sort of go back a little bit, so that was back in 2006 or something like that. So now fast forward 20 years, And we found that this whole term about the middle income trap was actually talked about a lot, but actually we found that there wasn't a clear sense of what kind of a framework should be applied in middle income countries. We thought they were different from low income countries that would rely largely just on accelerating investment, and upper income countries, high income countries, where of course innovation was an important part of a growth or development strategy because these countries were close to the world technology frontier. In between, there were these middle income countries. And then the question was, is there a good framework for them? What that World Development Report tries to do is provide that framework. And just by the way, it's very difficult to provide a framework for countries that now host about 6 billion people. So you have a lot of heterogeneity between these countries. And if you look at India, for example, I mean, if we had to write a report on India alone, it wouldn't be exactly the World Development Report because, India is a big economy. India is a complicated country. And as somebody said, I think some years back, that whatever you say about India, the opposite is also true, right? But I feel like India is actually in a somewhat different situation than other middle income countries right now, and I can explain why.
Yeah, yeah. So we're going to get into India, of course, a lot in depth. But sticking with that middle income trap piece, right? So one of the things that in the meet I covered in my own book was this idea that technology today might possibly lead to a second great divergence. At least I examined that question and that possibility. Just for the context of everyone else, the first great divergence happens during the Industrial Revolution, right? And East Asia, which you were referring to, led post the 1950s, 1960s in many ways a convergence against to some extent. Right now, I'm talking between nations, and there are some signs that economists have pointed out to now that technology counterintuitively actually might not lead to more convergence but might lead to more divergence yet again, right? The second great divergence. Is that something that you have views on? Like, is your sense that part of that middle income trap, part of the reasons for that middle income trap might be that the frontiers of technology, technological innovation, and hence the wealth that innovation typically generates, right? For countries like the US and others, right? Where they build upon innovation and retain, happen, the names of the companies might change, but the geography of the companies that are leading the tech frontier today still remain in that geography, right? So is your sense that somewhere in this middle income trap concept also lies the idea that middle income countries are not being able to become producers of technology? Or is that something that, as I think you also point out in your 3I strategy, that's something that really realistically they should wait?
So, good question. So, I think it's worth widening the lens a little bit beyond just technology. And here's the reason why. So, we actually found that when we were trying to sort of find a good framework for middle income countries, we went back to the work of Joseph Schumpeter back in the 1940s and so on. And he has this very nice book called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. I think that just from that title, you can tell what that book covers. It covers economic issues, it covers social issues, and it covers political issues. So I think in some sense a good balance of these three things is what essentially middle income countries require. The most important part of this, I think, is the fact that when you go from a low income country to a high income country, the you go through these changes in the structure of the country, right? Huge changes in the structure of the economy. I'm talking about the way enterprise is organized, the way that socioeconomic mobility changes, as well as things like how do you use energy and things like that. So if you sort of look at all of those things, what we try to do in the World Development Report is we try to sort of say is what are good, reliable indicators of these structural changes. And one of the things that we said was, look, ultimately, it really is about becoming much, much more efficient in how you use capital, how you use talent, and how you use energy. the best way to get a metric of that is when it comes to enterprise, take a look at the value added of firms. And that's an important part. The second part is when you're looking at socioeconomic mobility, and try to measure socioeconomic mobility. Don't get distracted by things like static inequality and things like that. Okay. And then when it comes to energy, for example, there's a lot of discussion about clean energy versus not clean energy and so on. And what we talk about is no, it should be much more about how efficiently do you use energy. So just take a look at emissions intensity of output and so on. So by the way, I know that so after we launched the WDR in India, a lot of the discussion about the WDR has become about Viksit Bharat and whether or not India will get to developed economy status. Is India in a middle income trap? What's much more important actually is those other things in the sense of saying, look, let's get to very reliable indicators of structural transformation. So this whole debate about are big firms bad or small firms good and so on, misplaced debate. I mean, there are some big firms that are good. So the same big firms may be good in one aspect and not in another. Small firms, there's no reason why we actually have very different dynamics, small firm dynamics in India as compared to the US. In the US, you actually have firms that are small. Many of them are gone by the time they are gone within a few years because their place is taken by firms that are growing, right? And if you continue to have firms, for example, that don't add a lot of value, but stick around, they detract value from others because they are occupying resources and so on.
Correct. Talent, capital, inefficiency. Yeah. So I think I get that point. I think that that's a fair point. I think that the metrics that you need to be looking at might be a whole different set of metrics than the ones that are popularly, invoked in mainstream media, etc. You also talk about the fact that very few countries have made it out of this middle income trap.
Yes.
And while you call that record dismal, I think, I have a slightly different question. So, if we were to think about the ones that have actually made, right, ideally you'd want all of them to escape the middle income trap. But if you look at some of the examples that I think you've referred to in your report as well, what are some of the lessons that you draw from these countries that have actually managed to escape this trap? How have they done it, and what are some of the lessons for the ones that have not escaped the trap yet?
So there are three groups of countries. The most successful part of the world when it comes to convergence or escaping middle income is actually Europe. The European Union creates a very good umbrella in which these countries can actually end up benefiting from flows of capital without any of the destabilizing effects that we've seen in other parts of the world. And the other good thing about Europe was this umbrella that Western European countries, the European Union provided, did not prevent these countries from trading with other people too. So Europe had the highest levels of trade as a share of GDP. So that part, so I would take that lesson, saying you got to find a way to have openness. Openness not just to trading, but also to flows of capital and so on. You have to create the conditions. Now, of course, these are not easy to create. And Europe, in many ways, is a model for that, but it may not be something that other parts of the world can replicate. I think that the only part of the world outside of Europe that is coming close to that is Southeast Asia, actually, where you spend time. So that's the first part. The second group of countries are countries that, accidentally find a lot of natural resources that have to do with that energy part, especially, and what we actually find is that these countries, many of them don't have the structures of high income economies. They only have the incomes of high income economies. And so as a result, you sort of see that they have problems. So in a sense, when we classify them high income economies, it is much more a recognition of the limitations of our classification, actually, because if you look at the structures of this, and we get into those issues in the world development. Then there's a third group of countries. And the third group of countries, what they did was they ended up actually, through a really good combination of investment, very high rates of investment, through a very good combination of reform and opening up. Okay, so once you actually have that investment, you end up making sure that you actually get newer technologies and so on with which you actually produce more and more. And so what they've done is that they've actually brought in those technologies. And these are the countries that we talk about when we really talk, we're talking about South Korea, we talk about Taiwan, we talk about a few other countries, Chile, etc. Right? But there are a handful of countries. So there aren't that many. In fact, if you add up all of these, I would like to sort of say this is that if you add all of them up, the population in these countries that have grown from middle income to high income during the last 3 decades, there are about 30 of them, and their population doesn't add up to the population of Pakistan. So imagine if the entire achievement of the world was that one country the size of Pakistan became a high income economy. That is not something that we should be happy with. So that's really the story there. But at the end of it, what we try to do in that report is we try to sort of say is that, look, what is it? Extract the lessons. So of course you will always need investment. So if you don't have a good investment climate, you're not going to grow. Okay. So for example, we're talking about Pakistan right now. Their investment ratios are half of those of India. There's no way that they're going to be growing. Okay. Then, if you look at the second part, reform and opening up, in the sense of what we really want to do is, I think it's just a sensible thing to just sort of look to see how is it that other parts of the world, how have they attained greater efficiency in using resources, newer technologies, that's what we call them. And then you bring them in. It's not just bringing them in, it's also diffusing them widely.
Yeah.
Okay? And I think in many cases, by the way, countries like India and all give me a lot of encouragement because they've done this in certain aspects. They can do it more. And then the third part is don't switch too quickly to try to sort of say, no, you know what? I'm going to develop my own technologies, etc., because these things require subsidies, they require regulations and so on. And if you don't have very strong governance mechanisms, you can easily go astray. You can end up actually really succumbing to stronger interest groups and so on because you can't actually think. And that's the story of Latin America. That's the story of Latin
Yeah, yeah. I think in many ways without saying it, I think you've laid out the 3I framework. But let's put that out because I think it's a very good way to basically, I think, describe what you've already described just now: the investment piece, and waiting for the innovation piece, right? But tell us about that 3I piece, and then I have a follow-on question for you. As you know, I think about where India should focus its energies on that 1 to 2I to 3I path. But lay out that 3I framework for us as well.
So we find that when it comes to going from, let's say, $200 per capita, which is to $300 per capita, which is, by the way, where countries like South Korea and all started after the war in the 50s and so on. Getting from there to about $1,000 per capita is actually, relatively speaking, uncomplicated, at least in analytical terms. It is largely about making sure that you educate people and then you create a climate in which there's private investment. That's that. And if one does that, you actually end up getting to middle income. Now, once you get to middle income,
And domestic versus foreign investment, does that play a big role in that $200 to $1,000 journey? Doesn't
it
matter.
really doesn't matter. I think, I have yet to sort of see any country of any reasonable size create a good climate for domestic investment and a bad climate for foreign investment, or vice versa. Okay. I think they're fairly uncomplicated things to think about. They might be hard to put in place, and for a very good reason, by the way. They're hard to put in place because you have strong incumbent interests. So, for example, if you go back, beyond the time when you grew up, at the time that I grew up in India, you had these large firms that had an interest in
Retaining their,
not, yeah. And by the way, those large firms were not just private firms; they were also state-owned enterprises.
of course.
State-owned enterprises also had the same problem. They actually hindered development, I feel, because they made sure that these technologies from abroad were not widely available to people. There's a very nice book that Arvind Panagaria has written on a really good work of economic history to sort of see what happened during the Nehru era and so on. And
Which is
he sort
coming
of,
out soon, right? The one that's
which is
coming
coming
out.
out
Yeah,
soon.
yeah, yeah. I
And
was
I'm
thinking
reading it right now.
Yeah.
It's excellent. It is truly, truly a thing. And, basically what you sort of see over there is that, you create a model in which you actually empower these incumbents as a matter of strategy. Okay. And then you're stuck,
Yeah.
then you're stuck after that.
Yeah.
So
I'm
you
dropping
can't.
him on that book in a month. Yeah, soon.
Okay, okay. You must have him talk about it. You must
Yeah.
have him talk about it on your podcast because it is. I have already learned something, and I'm only like a third of the way through the book, right? Anyway, but back to this other thing. So I think then what you want to make sure is that the best way. I think the best way. The second part has been described. I think is the way that Deng Xiaoping described it in China, which was he just called it. It was a two-part strategy. He said reform and opening up. Okay, I mean, he explained it just like that, reform and opening up. So you reform domestically so that when you open up, you get the benefits of these new technologies and so on. You get the benefits of scale in the sense that, so that is the second part. I would sort of say very, very simple, reform and opening up. And again, like I said, you have to worry about these incumbents. Okay. You
Of
have to worry
course.
about them.
Correct.
The other thing that you have to worry about is that we have these old structures that may have served us well a long time ago, where but they are no longer good structures in the sense that they actually prevent people who have high ability and so on from being allocated into tasks that require those high ability. And while there are others who actually have low ability, but just because they are born into circumstances that allow them to occupy important positions, that is a standard problem in middle income countries. We have less talent and we allocate it less efficient. So we end up hurting ourselves in that sense.
Yeah. And just to be clear, so for listeners, so India is still in the lower middle income category as per the World Bank classifications. Um, South Korea, countries like that are obviously now in the higher income category. And China
Yes.
is now in the upper middle.
China is now in the upper middle on the cusp of what we would call high income. But remember, when countries become high income, according to the World Bank's definition, they reach a per capita income level of around $15,000. Okay, and if you compare that with the per capita income of the United States, which is the global frontier, basically, that's about 75,000, 80,000. So they don't actually get to even a quarter of US per capita income at the time. If you look at Korea, Korea has been remarkable in the sense of Korea is now half of US per capita income, you know, and that is a massive achievement. Yes.
Yeah, which is incredible. No, that's
Yeah.
right. That's right. So 200 to 1,000 was investment, education, 1,000 upwards for the middle income countries. You're saying there's the reform and the opening up piece, and that gets you to, let's say, a ten to $15,000 per capita income category, and that's your two I
in
stage.
addition in addition to keeping investment, because you need to keep investment levels very, very high. So if you look, for example, at investment levels in South Korea, in Japan before that, and in China after, investment levels were kept very high. I'm talking about above 35%. Okay. um, and so I mean, you have to, if you want to grow, you have to postpone consumption. That means you have to invest now, right? So yes, is delaying gratification. Yeah.
Correct. Which is what we teach all our kids now, or try to. That's right. Some I think children of an earlier India were taught that by there was no choice. But I think in the India we're growing up in now, the kids are growing up in now. Um, they have to be taught delayed gratification now increasingly. But so that gets you into your two I, right? Which is basically, as I understand, technology diffusion, right? So diffusing technology, adopting technology from outside, but then making sure that it gets adopted and diffused in various sectors and across your country as widely as possible. And then you want to get from that, out of that middle income trap. You're saying then the three I piece comes in to build upon the first I and the second I.
Absolutely. And by the way, I mean, I guess the best way to think about this is, if you don't get out of that first part, it's kind of like driving a car in first gear and expecting it to go faster and faster. It won't. If you switch too quickly to sort of say, oh no, you know what, just going to develop indigenous, it's like going into fifth gear and you'll stall the car, you know. And that the classic case of that was Brazil. By the way, for all these large countries, one has to remember India and others, or it's not the case that they're making this mistake across the board. So if you look, for example, if you look at Brazilian agriculture actually imported a lot of new technologies and so on. So if you look at Brazilian agriculture, these large farms and so on, they're actually quite efficient. Okay, it was Brazilian manufacturing and services where there was a lot of investment in indigenous technologies and so on. At the end, if you look at even successes there, like for example, Embraer, which is this jet that is built in Brazil, you actually find that they actually import a lot of the technology for that too. And there's nothing wrong with that. Why should you reinvent something that has been invented, tried, tested, and found successful somewhere else? You should just use it.
Correct. As long as you're not
So,
being denied that technology, then of course you should be using
absolutely.
it, importing it, utilizing it.
Absolutely.
So two questions. One on China first, and then we'll get to India, and then we'll switch to India. So on China, right? So I just had on a previous episode Michael Pettis and Adam Posen. I'm not sure if you're familiar with both of their arguments on China, but one of the arguments that Michael Pettis, who's also a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie, along with me, one of the arguments he was making was that the Chinese need to make that switch now from a high savings, high investment model to a higher wages, higher consumption model, but they're finding it very, very difficult. And that unless they make that transition, they're not going to actually be able to maintain the kind of growth rates that the Chinese economy has seen over the last 2 3 decades. Do you agree with that? Because as you were saying today just now, that maybe it's the delayed consumption piece that continues to be the right strategy. At what point do you feel the high investment, high savings model needs to be maybe transitioned over to a different model, if at all?
I have to agree with it because it's just restating the problem. So I don't think this is giving you any intuition into what China should be doing. It's just saying, oh, China should start to behave like a high income country. High income countries tend to have higher ratios of consumption to GDP as compared to investment to GDP.
His argument is that the Chinese economy or economists or the power decision makers that be have decided that they want the share of household income to be kept low. And he's saying that the policy is very clearly that household income has to be kept low, which is why consumption as a share of GDP is low, not because the Chinese don't like consuming. And so he's saying it's a matter of policy actually, and that unless that policy shifts, and from his perspective, he's saying that but almost by definition, he was saying that if you increase the share of household income as part of the GDP, as a percent of GDP, the share of business and government will fall as a percent. And he was saying that that seems very, very unpalatable right now in China. And that's really why the Chinese are not being able to increase consumption as a share.
So, okay, I find that to be a useful characterization of the problem. I don't know how helpful it is in trying to sort of see how China should actually get out of this. Now, if you sort of use our framework a little bit more and you sort of say, okay, what is it that, the structure of China's economy has to change. Now, if you go back, so I would sort of look at it this way. I would say, and here maybe my Chicago roots will come out a little bit here. But if you look at China 20, 30 years ago, China made these changes in economic policy where basically goods and services began to be intermediated by markets rather than by government, okay, through prices. And China got a huge boost as a result of it. Okay, the second, and by the way, the best way to compare China is not to compare it to India or compare India to China. The best way to compare China is to compare it with Taiwan. Taiwan and Hong Kong are the counterfactuals for China, right? Now, if you sort of look at them, what you sort of find is that, of course, they liberalized product markets, but China never liberalized factor markets. They never liberalized. The labor market has been liberalized very slowly over time. Land markets, especially rural land markets, have not been liberalized at all. And then if you look at capital markets, China still has a lot of directed credit. And the point is that the Chinese economy, meanwhile, has become much more complex. And there is a sense, I think, what the Chinese government has been struggling with is control over this. And, I think if one looks at the lesson of this, you don't want to actually control the economy the way that you control it when it was a relatively simple one. So because if you try to do that, what you end up doing is you can't control the economy, so you end up controlling information about the economy. And that's the problem right now, to a great extent in the case of China. And there's a temptation in other middle income countries and all too. So, if you can't control the economy, then okay, you know what? I'm going to control the flow of information.
Yeah.
That is a terrible thing to do, because what you end up doing is that then you end up controlling information for households and firms and so on, which is a very essential part of what they need to do. Yeah, because they need to make economic decisions, and these are complicated economic decisions. And if you control that information, or you distort that information, even worse, they're going to make wrong decisions, right? So let's say, for example, that you find that because of the changing structure of the economy, because of the way it's being regulated and so on, you find that you see an increase in educated unemployment. Okay? And that's a very important signal for households as well as for firms and so on, saying, that why is educated unemployment rising to levels that could be 30-40% of these things? If instead what you sort of say, okay, you know what, I'm going to control this information, I'm not going to let you see it, how could that be a good thing? How could that be a good thing, right? So that's the same sort of thing that I think that the kind of problems that China is facing today, or that Brazil faced, are the sort of things that India will face, or India is already perhaps facing right now. And I think at this point you have to see, if you try to control, if you try to control the economy, you will fail when the economy becomes complicated, and then you'll be tempted to control information about the economy, and and that's a dead end. I mean, talk about accelerating into a middle income trap. That's what it would be.
Yeah. No, I think a very strong word of caution, I think, to be kept in mind for middle income countries. Now, let's switch. I know we've been flirting around the implications of all of this for India. So let's dive right in. Let's start with clearly what the key recommendations for India are. You have a great table that for people who are listening who end up looking at the report, where you lay out this 3I strategy. There's a column for the lower middle income countries, the 2I path, the investment plus technology infusion, capital infusion piece is clearly the path you are recommending for a country like India, which is in that lower middle income category today. Talk to us about, is India getting that piece right, or what you recommend? Or where is India maybe not getting things right? Like what is India getting right as per you for that 2I strategy, and where is it maybe not getting it right yet?
So I think the summary is India's getting a lot of things right. Okay, so it's not like India is on the wrong track or so. I think India is on the right track. I think that if there's any quibble that we should be discussing is the speed of
The
this.
pace at which, yeah.
Yeah. And the reason why the speed is important, Anirudh, is because so for example, for the countries that are middle income economies, things have become tougher now than they were a decade ago or 2 decades ago. So things are getting tougher and tougher, which means that these countries are going to have to do more and more difficult things in order to exit middle income and become high income economies.
Geopolitically, like in terms of geopolitics, in terms of trade,
In
those
terms
kinds
of
of things.
geopolitics, I mean, if you look, for example, on trade, the space is getting constricted. If you look at home demography and so on, the space is getting constricted. If you look at things like climate change and so on, the space is again getting constricted. A large part of the success of middle income countries was access to cheap and reliable energy. That it's not going to be cheap, even if it is reliable, and sometimes it's not going to be reliable either. So those are the sort of issues that we actually. Now, you say, all right, that's generally true, I think. But I think for India, it may not be nearly as true as it is for some of the other countries. For one thing, the fact that there is a shift out of that has been prompted by a sense that there was an over reliance on China in terms of manufacturing is that's going to help India. It can't hurt India. Okay, so in that sense, the external environment is not nearly as bad for India as it is for China, right? That's one thing. The second thing is if you look at where India's demography is right now, India's at this point where India, you have. So I think India's at peak potential domestically because if you sort of look at dependency ratios and so on, they're about as low as they'll ever be, you know, and they'll be this way for the next couple of decades and so on. So if India finds a way to use this thing, so India is actually at peak potential. The other thing I think that India has gotten to this point is I think India has gotten to it in a very with some really good fundamentals. So, for example, I think India did a good job of tax reform. It's a very difficult subject and so on, but India's tried to unify the tax systems across the countries so that you can have a large market, etc. So that's a very good, what I would call a horizontal reform.
So GST, correct? Yeah.
The GST. The second one is India has made a big push on infrastructure. Now, again, so I'm talking about these things with a fair amount of deliberation because I'm not talking about manufacturing or services or agriculture or agribusiness. I'm just talking about these things that cut
Correct.
across.
Cut across, yeah.
Cut across. The third thing that India has done, a similar thing, is digitalization. And by the way, all of these initiatives are actually fairly bipartisan, at least in their roots. They're very bipartisan in the sense that both the Congress and the BJP have championed these at some point or the other. And I think that over the last decade or so, many of these have come to fruition, right? But that's the third part about making sure that you bring in these technologies from abroad, digital technologies. Many of them are not homegrown. Some of them might be. But you have a lot of digital innovation in countries like the US and Europe and so on. And India has actually brought all of this stuff together. These three lay a very good foundation for India to move on to the next step. Now, what's the next step? I think the debate in India right now is a lot of people are thinking of the next step as a very vertical one, saying, okay, let's go big on services because we missed the boat on manufacturing. Other people are saying, no, we've got to do manufacturing too. And then the third group is saying, oh, but wait a second, more than half of people still work in agriculture. What about agriculture? Yeah. And there can be huge gains in agricultural productivity, massive gains from the same thing, from bringing in new technologies from abroad. Look at the technologies that we brought in from abroad in the case of the Green Revolution. These are not homegrown technologies. They were brought in from Mexico and the US, mainly the US, right, with Norman Borlaug and others. So I think in the same way, one can sort of think. So I would much rather sort of think about this in terms of the next horizontal initiative. And if I had to pick one, it would be education. I think that over the next 2 decades, if India ends up, I keep saying we because I think like an Indian, I'm wearing orange. I could be wearing orange, green, and blue here. But what I'm saying is that India has to sort of think of the next. I think when it comes to government initiatives, India needs to perhaps think much more on the next horizontal initiative, and I think that would be education rather than thinking narrowly about services.
Services versus manufacturing versus other.
And when I read Raghu's book, I found that was what he was arguing too. I don't know if the debate reflects it, but the book actually is very, very clear that, that we need a big push on education and so on, because that will actually help us come to the right decisions when it comes to manufacturing versus services versus other things.
Yeah. And I think for a country as large as India, as you were saying earlier, right? I mean, whatever you say, the opposite is also true. I don't think that India is in a position to say that let's just choose one vertical and not the other. I think it's really, I liked the framework you had laid out earlier about the energy piece and the talent piece. And I think that's reflected in your report as well, that you've got to make sure that there's efficiency in the use of your resources, whether it's capital, whether it's talent, and otherwise, and energy. And so, using that framework again, I want to delve deeper for assessing where India is doing well. You mentioned that, even in that table, the 3I strategy table I was referring to earlier, you have these three buckets, right? You have the talent and the enterprise and the energy, right? When you say education has to be the next horizontal reform push, let's say, for India, it seems to me that you had in some way or form, also saying that maybe it's the efficient use and allocation of that talent and training, right? That's missing. So I want to come back to that. But before we get back to that talent piece, on that enterprise and on the energy piece, how is India doing? And what does it maybe need to change?
I would say on the enterprise piece, I would not give India very high marks based on taking a look at the indicators. And those all laid out in the World Development Report very nicely. And actually, we have a lot more work that we did that is not reflected in the thing, but which, if you actually go to the website, you'll see. I think the best way to think about this is the following. If you take the typical middle income country when it transitions to high income, Anirudh, if you added up its capital and human capital, let's say, right, at that point, it comes to roughly two-thirds of that of the United States, or about 70%. Okay? At that point, I think we talked about it earlier. If you look at its income, it's about a fifth. So basically, the main difference, of course, then has to be efficiency. It has to be, are these countries using these resources, the talent and the capital and the labor and the energy? Are they using it efficient? Are they converting it efficiently into incomes? And the answer is no.
And that's
That's the,
productivity as well. Like, are you when you say efficiency, almost are you also referring to productivity, or is that
it's the same. It's the
same?
same. You can call it whatever you want. Yeah. Yeah. I call it value added because productivity, I think in general, policymakers don't understand what productivity is. You know, I think. But but I shouldn't be saying this in a derogatory way.
So, now
Because
it's a secret is
it's
out.
a it's a I think economists cannot explain that particularly well, but let's just call it efficiency, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a way that you convert
So you're saying
is
on
the efficiency.
enterprise, and so explain that. So where is India lacking in efficiency when it comes to enterprise? In other words, in layman's language, are you saying our businesses in India are not adding enough value add in their businesses? Or is there some other metric you're using to say Indian enterprise is not efficient?
It's that. It's exactly what you just said. And I'm not just talking about, and by the way, this is not just small enterprises and medium enterprises. It's also large enterprises, especially the state-owned enterprises. Yeah, yeah.
And what's the reason you think for that inefficiency compared to other countries, let's say, in Indian enterprise on value add and productivity and efficiency?
I think there's a very nice chart in the WDR that compares Mexico, the US, and India, and it tries to sort of see what happens to the size of the typical size of a firm of an thing. And what you sort of see is that Indian firms tend to stay small. They tend not to exit. In the US, firms that are not doing well tend to exit. Now, when they exit, they free up resources, they free up talent, they free up capital, and so on, which is used by firms that are being run better.
Yeah.
Roughly speaking, that's India's problem. Roughly speaking.
And on energy, so I think point on if the enterprise piece is I think clear. On energy, how is India doing? Energy efficiency?
I think on energy efficiency, India could do a heck of a lot better if India's state owned enterprises got out of the way. This is true across the board. So if you sort of look, for example, at the leaders in uh, fossil fuel fired energy, it's state owned enterprises. I'm talking about middle income countries now, not high income countries. High income countries are different. Okay. So state owned enterprises dominate the energy sector in middle income countries. And they tend to be fossil fuel powered. Now, if you look at the new ideas that are coming, the new, like essentially cleaner energy and so on, it is almost entirely private. So I think that's the real issue there. When we looked at this idea of Joseph Schumpeter and so on, the classic Schumpeterian idea was exactly that you have these big firms that will prevent innovation. You have these new firms that are trying to come in. These big incumbents have to sort of, in a sense, they have to die. You know, they have to be chucked out of activity. Otherwise, you will not get innovation. Schumpeterian theory has moved on from that and said you don't have to have, you can actually have large incumbents that actually do a lot of innovation. So, for example, in the case of telecom, we know that in the case of telecom, there are some Indian enterprises that have aided innovation massively. You know, that's the reason why we say don't focus too much on the size of these firms and so on. It has to do about connectedness to government and so on. By the way, the same enterprises that did such a good job on telecom, what you find is that the same conglomerates, when it came to the farm reform. So I talked with farmers in Punjab and so on because my family are farmers in Punjab, and I found that part of the reason why they were against the farm reform, of course, part of the reason why they were against the farm reform was because the current status benefits them, right?
Works really well.
It works really well for them, especially the big farmers. Okay. But part of it was also because they felt like that the role of government, which they could influence through the vote and so on, would be replaced by large enterprises, which they could not influence through the vote. So there, I think that's a failure of policy. That's not a failure of, that's not a political thing. I think it's a policy thing. Yeah.
So let's get back into talent and education, right? So I think India, obviously, from when I was growing up, the terms that we've been hearing for a long time now is demographic dividend, terms like that, right? We have the largest population. We are a talent nation, even in the context of tech and IT services, and NASSCOM's vision, for example, of India is as a talent nation, right? So talent, people is at the core of what India sees as at least one of its core advantages. Where is India, according to you, on that education and talent and skill development front and the efficiency in it, but also the allocation, etc. And what could India be doing better?
I think the thing that strikes a person who doesn't know the specifics of India, and I know that this is debated, has to do with the talents of women.
Yeah.
Okay, and are we using the talents of women well in India? And I would say that I think any honest assessment of that one would be that India is not doing it well. Now, you could say there are parts of India that are doing it better than others, but let's just take northern India. Northern India is home to like a tenth of the world's population, okay, and more than half of India's population, right? So you sort of say, do we do a good job of making sure that the talents of women in India are used well? And the answer, I think, would be no. I mean, because you've lived in the United States, you would actually understand this thing that if you look, for example, at the security, speaking about public security, right? So public security in the United States is very different in a large inner city than it is in a suburb. Okay. The way I would sort of see it is northern India is like a suburb for men and it's like an inner city for women. Okay. I mean, this is a policy issue. This is not a social issue and things like that. This is a policy issue. So I think these are the sort of things that I think India needs to look at. And then there, of course, there's a whole debate about labor force participation of women and so on, whether that is thing. Once you get rid of all of this stuff, it's not the case that labor force participation for women is going to equal that of men. But it certainly shouldn't be a third of that of men.
Yeah. What do the journeys or trajectories of other, let's say, lower middle income countries that have transitioned to even upper middle income countries, or if not higher income countries, what does that suggest? Are there structural changes that we're likely to see? Because I've seen some stats of places like Korea and Vietnam and others in East Asian countries, and it seems like that the labor force participation of women in those countries seems to be significantly higher than what you see in India. So, what are some of the lessons maybe that Indian policymakers could draw from the journeys of those countries, trajectories of those countries?
I think that you've actually summarized it. I mean, fairly well. I think that communism actually helped that thing. I mean, we don't. But more recently, I've actually seen there are countries like Saudi Arabia. If you look at Saudi Arabia and you sort of say, Saudi Arabia doubled the female labor force participation in 10 years. And it was basically just policy, making sure that, for example, and I mean, you have to do the policy part sensibly in the sense that the first part is you have to sort of change rules where you say women are not allowed into this building or women are not allowed after a certain amount of time. So they got rid of that, right? But then the second part is you actually have to do a little bit more than that, making sure, for example, things like public security and so on are improved, right? But my sense from Saudi Arabia and from a few other countries like that is that these things actually can change very, very quickly.
Very quickly. Yeah.
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 And by the way, you know, going back to the part where we're saying, no, look, we need to do a big push on education. Yes, but a big push on education will take time to yield fruit. Meanwhile, you have a lot of educated people, motivated people, just waiting on the fringes of economic activity, and you want to get them into it in a big way.
Yeah, yeah. What about R&D, right? So I think one of the key implications of what you're suggesting for India, which is that 2I strategy, is by definition saying don't do 3I, because that's what, as you were also saying earlier in the conversation, that's what countries like Brazil and some Latin countries tried too early. Economies ended up getting sputtered, inefficient allocation of capital, etc. In the last year or two, and there's something I've been crying horse on, that from a tech standpoint, for me, two very simple stats matter. Like if you look at any of the technologically advanced nations in the world, countries that I said in my book were winning at the great tech game, including China more recently over the last 2-3 decades, spending on R&D, just as a very simple, it's a flawed metric maybe in many ways, but as a simple starting point metric, R&D as a percentage of GDP, R&D spend has to be, if you look across countries, in the range of 2.5, 3.5%. India today stands at 0.6%, has stood at that for the last 30 years. China in 99 was at 0.6, 0.7% of GDP. India was at the same number. Today, China is upwards of 3%. Korea is, I think, upwards of maybe even 4%. Israel, similar numbers. US has made a massive push in the last few years, now under President Biden, to take that number from 2.5 to 3.5%. So is R&D, is that argument that I'm making and then a few other people seem to be making, is it flawed? Is it too early for India to do that today?
No, I don't think it's true. I mean, one is, of course, there are sectors in which India is actually close to the technology frontier of the world, and I mean, we also know that there are, I think, there are economic imperatives for India to become the owner, or Indians to become the owners of intellectual property around AI related technologies and so on, and others, so I wouldn't say that we should be, so I would never be hard line about this because there are lots of things. I think the real issue over here is how much of this R&D should be public and how much of it
Versus
should be
private.
private. I would say the model would be much more like that of the United States, where even public money is really channeled through private hands. Unlike, for example, Brazil, where you actually had a lot of the R&D through these public organizations, and the same thing is true, of course, the same thing is true in China. So I would sort of say much more like the United States. Now, in that case, I would sort of say, of course, given the fact that, so I'm a firm believer that actually nations at all levels tend to underinvest in R&D because of the huge public benefits, huge spillover benefits from R&D. But it's how you do it, because if you end up doing it in a way, yeah, private R&D would be, I would say, encourage it through regulation, through taxes, as well as selectively also through public finance. But like, for example, if you look at the changes that were made in the United States over the last, I think, like about 2 or 3 decades ago, changing the way that R&D money is spent, it's much more private. So, for example, even public money which goes to a private enterprise and leads to an innovation, the intellectual property is often held by the academic institution or the private.
Correct.
The other thing is even the money that goes through to R&D through the academic channel, through universities and so on, is done in a way that it actually encourages greater university and industry linkages. So I mean these are things that you know well, I think, but I would sort of say it shouldn't be about whether or not we should be spending on R&D. We should. It's how we spend that money. If it's through the private channel, there will be waste. R&D is a wasteful activity, right? There will be waste, but there will be it would be money that would still yield any cost benefit, that would actually satisfy any cost benefit criteria, because the spillover benefits are so massive. So even with all of that waste.
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about industrial policy, right? I mean, now there are two or three main things. You've referred to the Viksit Bharat idea that is being
Ah,
talked about.
so I just wanted to sort of tell you something. So there was this really nice observation or really nice passage in Arvind's book, Arvind Panagaria's book, where he talks about when India was doing the 5-year plan, I think it was the second 5-year plan, and he said that there was consensus among people in the government as well as foreign experts and so on that India should do this big push, Soviet style, on heavy industry and things like that. And then you have the cottage industries and so on that'll create jobs, and these industries would create value. It was this sort of a thing. I mean, that was Nehruvian thought, right? Fabian socialism and so on. And there was one person who dissented, and that was Milton Friedman from the University of
Oh,
Chicago.
Chicago.
He had not been invited by the government of India. He'd been invited by the US government. And what Arvind says is, so his critique of that approach proved to be prophetic. Okay, I think we need thinking like that too. When you have this group think about, the worst thing that can happen in India is group think right now, in the sense that if you somehow critique the government, you're seen as not patriotic or not. I mean, that is a terrible path to go on. So you need somebody like this, because history is full of such insights where you have one person saying, "No, I think this is wrong. You guys are engaging in groupthink."
No, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that's part. I think part of the exercise I'm undertaking, I think, as part of this podcast, is to make sure that there isn't groupthink in India. That you have enough of the global as well as Indian, right? Again, the nationality really doesn't matter here. It's the ideas that matter, and it's the critiques that matter, because ultimately they all help to make you better, or at least question your assumptions, right, in certain decisions. So I want to spend a couple of minutes on the Atmanirbhar Bharat, PLI schemes, Viksit Bharat idea, which is largely, if I was to summarize it from my perspective, and you might have a different view of it from the World Bank perspective or the DC perspective, is this idea that let's build at least a stronger manufacturing base than we've had. Let's look at some of the tech driven sectors like electronics, manufacturing, semiconductors, etc., and build capabilities through subsidies there. And then let's get to what people are saying, developed economy by 2047. So I want to get your views on this set of things that's part of the economic policy mainstream in India, and tell me where you think maybe the focus areas are right and where maybe they might be misplaced.
So, I know that, for example, there's a lot of discussion about whether or not Viksit Bharat, which is developed economy status by the time of the 100th year of our independence, is a good thing. I think it's a very good way to think about it, because it creates ambition and so on. So I think as a motivational device, it is excellent. So I'm actually very, very supportive of such things. By the way, other countries do the same thing. So it's not, I mean, India is not an outlier here. If you look at the plans of like China or Vietnam or others, so all these countries that are impatient, ambitious, and so on, they are out there. So I think one should have.
Do they also put per capita targets, per capita GDP income targets also, or is it always largely just the aggregate number?
It varies. It varies. I think the target should be per capita. I'll tell you why. Because as an international economist, people care much more about the size of India's GDP. So looking at it from the outside. But as an Indian citizen, I care much more about India's per capita income, right? So I think it's leave it to foreigners to worry about the aggregates. I think that Indian policy should be ambitious about the per capita part. Okay. Now, there, I think, if you look at all of the so all of the debate around the WDR and so on about the World Bank is wrong and this and that, I think it's a little misplaced, because what we end up having there is we are saying, we have a model. It's a fairly mechanical model, and you plug in numbers into it, growth rates that are realistic given the past, and then you say, when does India get to a per capita income level that is a quarter of that of the United States? Remember, the US per capita income is also expected to grow. So as a result of it, then you sort of say, that takes a long time given India's current growth rates. Okay. Then you say, okay, well, India may actually not have these growth rates. It may have something higher than this. But then that's where comparisons with China and all start to matter. If you look at China's growth rates during China's 3 decades of massive growth, they are much higher than what India has ever achieved. Okay. Much higher.
They were going into double digits almost. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, we're talking about 5%. They're talking about 10% there. So then if you say, all right, then if you sort of really want to, if you really want to measure yourself by those metrics, be brutal about it and say, here's how it is. And then you start to sort of say, okay, then we need to radically change the way that we do, and the kind of things that we're talking about. The kind of things like a huge push on education, a massive increase in female labor force participation, things like that. It can be done. It can be done, but it requires a massive amount.
Yeah, yeah. And will industrial policy be a good idea for a country like India? So, of course, the US is going towards it. A lot of the world seems to now be talking about industrial policy again. Is that a good idea for India, given the stage of development, given the kind of mix of economic activity we have?
So here's my thinking about industrial policy. So you have success stories like Korea, right? They did engage in industrial policy in the sense that they actually tried to sort of encourage firms that they thought would actually add more value, right, through public money, through regulations, et cetera, favoring them. But they always, I mean, again, I'm speaking about this in very, very broad terms, because when you look at the economic history, things are a bit more mixed. But when you sort of look at that, you find that what these countries had was they had this advantage that they could get these firms to compete abroad, and the firms that competed and won, they were supported. Firms that were shown to be weak when you actually measured them in terms of how well they could compete abroad, those firms tended to get less and less. Those firms tended to get less and less support. So I don't know if India follows a strategy like that, but if it did, then I would say industrial policy is good, with 2 caveats. Another caveat is the world environment has changed. Now, this could lead India. So basically, this external gauge of the effectiveness of industrial policy at home is becoming less and less reliable. So then you say, okay, I'm going to use that as a gauge. I know it's going to be less and less reliable, but I'm going to use some other one. And the other one is I'm going to use an internal gauge. I'm going to try to see, are we adding value with this? Are these firms adding more value than the ones? Once you start to sort of do that, then you enter into a world where we basically say you should have a lot of debate about these things. People look at the kind of debates, smash mouth debates that you sort of see in the United States. But those smash mouth debates are needed in order for you to sort of say, okay, you know what, this money was not well spent. Okay, somebody's watching. You have a free press. You have essentially good economic analysis, and the government provides that information freely and widely. If you don't do that, the role of government is to provide that information, not hide it. Because once you hide it, then there are all kinds of suspicion about, this firm is very connected to this particular party, that firm is very connected to that one.
Ultimately flawed decision making starts to happen across the board.
Absolutely.
So, no, absolutely.
So yes, but you want to do industrial policy, but recognize that the prerequisites of successful industrial policy are much more than you think they are. They're not just about data information systems. They are also about creating a culture of debate, having think tanks, etc. I think that's where India is right now. We should be growing this, and I think we are, right? We should be growing this system of questioning each other and so on, in a free way without it being seen as patriotic or non-patriotic.
No, I mean, I think that's the point of the democracy, right? I mean, if you really truly believe that democracy is your strength, vis-a-vis, like, let's say, a China, then ultimately you have to take the strengths of a democratic system, which is active debate and transparency and accountability, and then, as they say, like the pilot who makes that 1% adjustment every time gets to the destination, right? So those slight adjustments consistently is what will get you there. So I agree with you, I think, on that. And this idea of not appointing or anointing national champions, but creating the conditions for firms to compete, giving them the base support to compete, and then whoever's competing the best, right?
Yeah.
Then maybe they get more over time. Correct. I think that's a learning I've heard from various people who've seen this model work out in the East Asian context as well. I know I've taken a lot of your time in the meet, but what I want to talk about before we conclude is AI. Right now, there isn't, I think, a hotter topic in conversations around the world in platforms like the World Economic Forum and also the World Bank and IMF and governments, boardrooms everywhere. So I'd be remiss to not bring that up and get your views on where one of the things I've heard, I think Geeta Gopinath from IMF say, and one of the reports I think the IMF put out, is that AI is likely to impact jobs more in developed nations than in developing ones. There's obviously the conversation around risk and safety in AI that's top of mind now in not just Washington but other capitals in Europe and elsewhere. What's your view on how AI is likely to impact the Indian economy, on how the Indian economists and policymakers should be thinking about AI, and of course where it intersects with the talent piece also that we were discussing, so its impact on jobs maybe in India as well.
Anirudh, so on this one, so we actually looked at this quite a lot. I think that there are these three effects that these new technologies, let's call them AI, but I think the World Economic Forum calls them like the fourth industrial revolution or industry 4.0.
Yeah, he's
Yeah,
called it the fourth IR. That's
yeah.
right.
I think it's called industry 4.0 or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, fourth industrial revolution or something like that. That's
Yes,
right.
exactly. So if you actually look at these, you actually find that there are these sort of you can classify them into three parts. You can classify them into transactional, informational, and operational. Okay, and so then you start to sort of look at these, and you start to see they're actually differential effects of these things. So if one looks at them more closely, then you sort of say, okay, what are my objectives? And your objectives tend to be sort of twofold or threefold, depending on where you are in the world. The one part, of course, is competitiveness. You want to be more competitive. And all three of these, I mean, getting more of these technologies makes you more competitive, right? The second part is social, in the sense of social inequality, and that's what Geeta might be referring to when she talks about the effects of these technologies and so on, because they tend to be labor share displacing.
That's
So
right.
as a result, you need to have other mechanisms to offset that. Usually, fiscal tax and transfer mechanisms, right? And then the third part is, there are these spatial effects too. So so essentially, you can have some of these technologies are very concentrating. That makes sense to concentrate them just in a few places. And for a part of the world like the European Union, that matters a lot. They can't concentrate it all in Germany or all in the Netherlands because they have to. India has a similar issue. You can't concentrate it all in one state. So you actually, it's worth thinking about this in very, very simple economic terms, saying there are these three aspects of these technologies: the informational, the transactional, and the operational. And there are these three objectives that you have. And these technologies are not identical when it comes to these effects. Okay, so we've actually done quite a bit of work on this one, right? So that's the first part. But to my mind, that's only half the story, all of this stuff. The other half of the story is, and this is something that I know there's a lot of work being done in India about this, is how do you use these technologies to deliver on public services and so on better? Education, health, also things like what, things that I think in India would actually, there's a huge benefit for rural India. So just like what Geeta said was that, look, you have to think differently about developed economies and developing economies when it
Yeah,
comes to the effects of these technologies. The potential is also very, very different for urban India
this
versus
is
rural India. The upside for rural India is massive. Like, for example, if you look at health services, if you look at education, if you look at financial inclusion, if you look at agriculture for small farms and so on. So I think my own sense of it is that India should be a leader in this, and I think is becoming a leader in this, and India should be. Here's the other nice thing about India: unlike a lot of countries at that per capita income level, India has India has actually digitalized a large part of its infrastructure, right? Especially for these kind of things, which is a huge plus. So there are lots of countries around the world that at that per capita income level, these technologies have not been, they haven't laid the foundations of this digitalization. For all of these reasons, when you think about India, you say, oh, wow, India is at a really good place right now in terms of demography, in terms of technology, even in terms of international relations and so on. India is starting to be seen. I mean, the changes that are happening in East Asia and so on, they all favor India. They don't actually think. So, so there's no reason why India shouldn't be thinking about a higher rate of growth. I know, for example, that there have been observers. I'm trying to remember who now. I think it is Ruchir Sharma who says that, look, actually, it's going to be very hard for India to hit 7% and so on. I think it's just a question of imagination. If you imagine the kind of things that we are talking about, taking advantage of the things abroad, taking advantage of the massive effects of these horizontal initiatives that have been laid really good foundation for a big push on things like technology, on things like energy, or things like socioeconomic mobility.
yeah, yeah. No, so I think as we were discussing earlier as well, some time ago, that this whole DPI push, the digital public infrastructure push that with UPI and Aadhaar has sort of played out over the last decade, has largely, of course, driven financial inclusion. The number of transactions happening on that on the UPI stack is just exponentially exploding every day, every month. And I think now the thinking is, how do you extend it to other sectors, and exactly the sectors that you're referring to that are important in the context of rural India, in the context of AI coming in: education, healthcare, agriculture, right, and possibly logistics, transport and logistics, right. And I think if India can actually extend its DPI kind of infrastructure push that it's successfully done on the fintech side, on the financial services, financial transactions, payment side, into education, healthcare, and agriculture to solve real problems and remove real constraints in those sectors, I think that could really give you a big uptake in your GDP growth rates as well.
So
Um,
I know that rural development will take place in India. I think, to summarize, I would sort of say these new technologies offer us ways to accelerate that, so that happens within a decade or 2 decades rather than over a century. So I think that would be something. But again, I sort of feel like all of these things, the way to go back to Arvind's book, he sort of talks about the success of the period of Nehruvian economics, or that was basically political. I mean, India has become, according to the book and according to me, India has been a political success. That was a political unification, which is very durable. But then if you look at the economic part, we have a lot of leftover bad habits and outdated institutions for that time. And I think what has happened over the last 10 years or so is that some of that is being changed. And a
yeah,
good balance between these two, keeping the strong political and a strong unified India and so on across the states, across rich and poor, as well as across religion and things like that. I think if one does that and then changes this other part, and I think we're there. I think that India is going in that direction. My worry is India is not going fast enough. That's all.
Yeah, no, as you rightly said in the earlier part of the conversation, that it's the speed and pace. I think that we could be more ambitious with in India today. Um, let me just conclude with one quick question around the policy making process, the economic policy making process in India. You've seen probably this across various countries, and hence I wanted to ask you this: is there something in the economic policy making process in India that you would change?
Two or three things spring to mind. One of them is, this thing about the fact that we have an economic policy making process that is actually good for an agrarian India, but not an urban India. And I think one needs to sort of think about that and sort of see whether or not we actually give enough political and economic power to essentially cities. So that's one thing. Uh, the second one is, if I had to sort of say what have been my sort of observations, is that when I go to Delhi and talk to people in the central government, I sense I sense an urgency. You know. Then when I go to some of the states, some of the states, not all of them, I don't sense the same urgency about economic development. You know. I talk about my state, for example, Punjab. I don't sense it. So I think that's the other part. How does one get this sense of urgency? My own sense of it is that it's not the job of the central government to somehow export this urgency onto the states. I mean, it should try to just maintain that urgency thing. On the other hand, I think it is. I think it would be a good strategy to allow states that actually do have an urgency to be able to act on it and move ahead. You know, so kind of like the way that China, ended up having this thing along the coast, you have much faster development. In India, it won't be along the coast. It'll be much more related to the quality of governance in the states and so on. But I think that should be freed up. I think it should be allowed to sort of go
Is it
faster.
not
I
freedom?
don't know.
Is your sense that it's not? Because you do see states like Karnataka and Tamil Nadu today that are really at, it seems like, at the cutting edge of that technological piece and manufacturing, sort of higher tech manufacturing, etc. So I do sense this sense of competition. Of course, in a class of 30, uh, you'll never have 30 equally motivated at the same time students. So it's natural to have differences, of course. But I think the question you're raising is, how do you make sure that there's urgency and motivation even in the states that are lagging behind? At the same time, encouraging the ones that are saying, "Hey, listen, let me go free." But the ones that are going free, is your sense that they're being pulled back?
So I believe that they could go faster. So I believe that there is that there are elements in our governance. I don't know the details of this, but I know that that you actually do have elements in the governance that actually hold back some of the states that are doing well. It's very hard to push a state to go faster. I think so. I don't think that, but it appears to be easier in India to hold back a state that wants to go faster. You know, and I could imagine this in the case of Punjab 2 or 3 decades ago. I can now imagine it in the case of the Karnatakas and the Telanganas and so on too. And I'm not saying that they're not doing well. They're doing very well. What I'm saying is, again, it goes back to the same thing. If India as a whole is to grow at 9-10%,
Yeah,
then some of these states will have to grow at 15%,
like 15, 13,
right?
15%. That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. No, great. This has been fascinating. A lot of different things that we've ended up covering in almost an hour and a half now, as I see it. So thank you for being generous with your time. Um, two quick questions that I end every podcast with, which are much simpler, not related to economics per se. One is for people interested in the kind of discussion we've had, the kind of topics we've covered in the meet, a book that you recommend. It can be more than one book, but at least one book. It's not yours or mine, some other book that you would recommend. And second is a podcast guest.
So I would say that there are two books I would recommend right now. One is Arvind Panagaria's a book that's coming
Coming
up.
book. Yep.
Yeah. And then the second one is the World Development Report 2024.
No, that's cheating. As I said, you cannot say anything that's your own. So,
It's not mine. It's the work of a very, very good team.
well, you're
Uh,
part of the team. So you'll have
that's
to give a second one for us.
so that's one. The on podcast guests, I actually had a thought on this one. I know that you have had an excellent group of people. In fact, our external affairs people said that your podcast is a really good one, a very high
Thank
quality
you.
one,
That's
which
very kind of you.
has a high thing. I may take a rain check on that one, but I would say definitely talk to Arvind Panagaria after
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
launches.
I'm scheduled to speak with him later this month, as soon as book is out publicly in India.
Yeah, and have him just talk only about the book rather than about the finance commission and so on, because I feel like he's actually plugging a big gap where we whenever we talk about that age of Nehruvian economic policy, it ends up becoming about politics rather than about economics. And what he's done in that report in a very good way is stick to the economics.
Yeah. Yeah. What about India's trade policy? Other than Arvind, of course, who's written a book, I think, on Indian trade policy, which I've read cover to cover. Any other thinkers, economists, or otherwise around the world that you think um, could help us unpack India's trade policy, where its strengths and weaknesses lie?
The name that pops in my mind as you ask me that question is Richard Baldwin.
Okay.
Richard Baldwin. The reason why I think the reason why that is a bit of a difficult subject, and is that the world trade environment is in flux still. So when people say, "Oh, it's terrible," it's too early to decide whether it's terrible or good or whatever. I think in a couple of years we will know. But a lot of the trade now actually takes place through global value chains, and global value chains are in a state of being re-engineered.
Churn, yeah.
Yeah, until that happens, we won't be able to tell. And Richard actually is a very good person to actually to talk about these kind of things while they're happening.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
No, great. Thank you. This has been fascinating. Thank you for the time. And of course, I hope to see you. We all hope to see you in India soon.
it'll be a pleasure. Next time I come, we will meet.
That'd be lovely. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anirudh.